Today is Monday, Yud Aleph Teves, Tovshin Ayin Gimel. We are the Mamar Vekibel Hayehudim of Purim Tovshin Yud Aleph in Teres Menachem Sefer HaMamorim Tovshin Yud Aleph Tovshin Yud Beis, and we are on page Mem Gimel, and we're up to chapter 7, Ois Zayin. We are in the middle of discussing the three dimensions that exist in a mitzvah: the tachton, the low aspect of the mitzvah; the elyon, the high aspect of the mitzvah; and the force, the power that combines the two. We have that in the mitzvah. You have the physical object, which is the tachton, the low aspect. You have the elyon, which is the kedusha, the godliness that we draw down into the mitzvah, and then we have the power that fuses the two. So too, in the source of the mitzvah, we have three ways of performing a mitzvah. We have a way of performing a mitzvah by habit, which represents the lower way of performing a mitzvah. We have the way of performing a mitzvah in order to be connected to Hashem, which is the elyon, the higher aspect of the mitzvah. And then there is a way of performing a mitzvah simply because it is God's will, without any motive whatsoever. And that is the highest, that's the force which is beyond the two. Similarly, in the source of the mitzvah, we have these three dimensions, and also in the learning of the Torah. That's what we learned about yesterday. That in the learning of the Torah, you have these three dimensions as well. In the learning of the Torah, he's not talking about the mitzvah of learning Torah, because the mitzvah of learning Torah has these three dimensions as well, just like any other mitzvah. But in the actual learning of the Torah itself, we have similarities, examples of these three dimensions. There's a way of learning Torah because of the intellectual ideas that the Torah represents, the fact that the Torah is an intellectual pursuit. If you learn Torah in that way, one learns Torah, one is driven in that sense to learn the Torah because of the intellectual interest that a person might have. So that's the low way of learning Torah. That is common to any other the motive for studying any other intellectual pursuit. The higher way of learning Torah is in order to connect to Hashem, because Torah is an intermediary through which a Yid connects to Hashem. As the Zohar says, there are three things that connect one to another, that are tied one to another: Yisrael, Eraisa v'Kachbrichu, the Jewish people, the Torah, and God. So that's the higher way of learning Torah, when one learns Torah in order to connect to Hashem. And then there is something which is beyond those two, and that is the fact that Hashem has inserted himself in the Torah. Anon nafshi ksavis yehovis. Anoichi, the word Anoichi, the first word of the Ten Commandments, stands for the four words Anon nafshi ksavis yehovis, as the Talmud says in Shabbos. I, my soul, I have written in and given away in the Torah. So in other words, when one learns Torah, not as an intermediary to connect to something else, but rather the Torah itself is the end. The Torah itself is the end, not as a means to something else. And when one learns Torah with the knowledge that God has inserted this very essence into the Torah, his devotion to Torah, his commitment to learning Torah is on a completely different level. And these three ways of learning Torah emanate from three aspects in the three dimensions in the Torah itself. Torah is Chochmah v'Seichel, ki hi Chochmaschem v'Naschem le'nei ha'amim. Torah is Jewish intellect, as the Talmud says, as the Torah says, as is written in Chumash. Then there is a higher dimension to Torah, and that is that the Torah is this intermediary that connects the Jewish people to Hashem. And then but in that sense, there is Hashem and there is the Torah. At the very highest level, Hashem and the Torah are one. So these are the three recurring dimensions that the Rebbe discusses in mitzvahs, in the source of mitzvahs, in the way to perform a mitzvah, and so too in Torah, in the way to learn Torah, and in the source of Torah. Now the Rebbe takes it a step further. There are laws, there are dinim in Shulchan Aruch that tell us about our obligation to learn Torah. And not all obligations are equal. Depends on the circumstances of the person. And in the laws of learning the Torah, we also find these three elements, as discussed previously, as I just outlined. And that's where we're up to. Ois Zayin, page Mem Gimel at the bottom. V'hinei Gimel in Yanam Hanal, these three above mentioned matters. Yesh dugmoson gam bedine b'hilchas haTorah, b'hilchas Talmud Torah. We also find examples of them in the laws that govern the learning of Torah. There are basically generally three levels in learning Torah. Three levels in terms of the laws of learning Torah. One is the very basic one. The very basic level of learning Torah is you learn Torah for the purpose of knowing how to conduct yourself. A person has to know how to live as a Jew. So where does one find out how to live as a Jew? You learn Torah. You learn the laws that pertain to how you need to live. That's the basic level. The next level is there's a chiyuv, an obligation for a Jew to know Torah, to have knowledge in Torah. That goes beyond the obligation to learn Torah for the purpose of knowing how to live as a Jew. Then there's a third obligation, and that is to toil in Torah day and night. That every spare moment that the person has should be completely dedicated to the study of Torah. What are these three obligations of learning Torah? Laws of learning Torah. So the Rebbe spells it out. The obligation to learn those laws, those halachas that are necessary for us in order to know how to act, in order to know the actions that we need to do. This is similar to the idea of learning Torah motivated by the nature of the body and the natural soul. Why? How do we perform a mitzvah? How do we perform mitzvahs that depend on our actions, or even mitzvahs that depend on our speech? What gives us the power to do that? It's through the body, right? We act through the body, we speak through the body, and the life-giving soul that allows us to act and allows us to speak. So the study of the halachas, the laws that pertain to action, to how I need to act, those are related to what? Learning Torah in that way is related to the body and the nature of the person. So that's the tachton, the low dimension. Then we have another obligation, that is the obligation to know Torah, to have knowledge of Torah. Leida kol Torah kula. To how far does the obligation of knowing Torah extend? It extends to the entire Torah. One has an obligation to know the entire Torah, or as much of it as one is able to know. Even those matters in the Torah that are not relevant to action. So, since the idea of this mitzvah is that the person should know the Torah, even though it's not related to action, so it's a higher way of learning Torah, but it's still related to the fact that what? That the person should know the Torah. That's similar to knowing the Torah for the purpose of the soul. That's driven by the soul. It's not related to the action of the person. It's really irrelevant to the person's action. So what's the point of it? It's connected to the soul. So that's the Elyon dimension of Torah, of learning Torah. And then the Rebbe goes in and says, he adds to this point, there is a limit to the mitzvah of knowing the Torah. Why? What does it mean there's a limit to the knowledge of the Torah? It is possible to learn the entire Torah. The obligation of knowing Torah extends to what? To the entire Torah. So there is a mitzvah. We are instructed that to the best of our ability, and there are those that are able, to know the entire Torah. So the Rebbe asks a question in the brackets. The Rebbe says, we know that it says in Eve, in Job, it says, Arucha me'eretz mida, concerning Torah, it says that Torah is beyond measure. So what does it mean that there is a limit to the knowledge of Torah, that it is possible to know the entire Torah? So the Rebbe explains that in terms of depth, in terms of layers and layers, inner layers and inner layers of knowledge, meaning the basic level of knowing the subject, then there's a deeper level of knowing a particular subject, and so on and so forth. To that, there is no limit. Let's put it this way. In depth, there is no limit, but in width, there would be a limit. In other words, in terms of the knowledge of the entire Torah, one is able to know the entire Torah. How deep one knows the entire Torah, to that there is no limit. But the main point being, that it is possible to know the whole Torah. For example, Maimonides says in his preface to the book of Rambam, of the Yad HaChazaka, of Mishnah Torah, he says that if a person learns Chamisha Chumshei Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and then learns Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, you know the whole Torah. You've basically covered the entire Torah. Right? So there is a limit. So indeed, why is there a limit? Why is it possible to know the entire Torah in the way we just described? Because since this aspect of learning Torah is connected to the person, that the person is the one that's learning the Torah, albeit driven by the neshama, rather than, in other words, driven by the elyon, the higher dimension. But since it's connected to the person, and the person is limited, therefore, the knowledge in Torah is also limited. It's possible to know the entire Torah. That's the point that I was making. So again, we could say, this is the reason why there is a limit, and a measure and a limit to the mitzvah of knowing the Torah. And then again qualifies that. That which it says in the pasuk, that it's beyond measure. That means to say that there is no end, there is no limit to the depth of the reasoning of the reasoning of the halachas of the Torah. But the laws themselves, and also medrash and so on and so forth, there is actually a number, they are limited. And indeed we know that there were, as the Talmud says, and Alter Rebbe brings in Hilchos Talmud Torah, that there were a number of people who did cover the entire Torah. Not only in the way I just described in terms of learning Chamisha Chumshei Torah and the Rambam, but actually started the entire Torah in its full version, rather than in the abridged version of the Chumash and the Rambam. So that's just a qualification to the fact that the Rebbe says that Torah does have a measure, that it is possible to cover the entire Torah. Why is it possible to cover the entire Torah? Since the mitzvah of knowing Torah is what? That the person should know the Torah, and the person is limited. Therefore, the Torah that we are talking about, which is related to this mitzvah of knowing Torah, it's with a measure and with a limit. But then there is a way of learning Torah which is completely beyond the two we just mentioned. There is an obligation that one should toil in Torah day and night, which means even someone who has finished learning the entire Torah. And similarly, also those that have smaller minds and will never reach the level of knowing the entire Torah, both of these two extremes still have an obligation of toiling in Torah day and night. For what purpose? It's not for the purpose of knowing the mitzvahs that we're going to do, that one should do. It's not for the purpose of knowing the entire Torah because either I know it or I never will. So why do I have an obligation to learn Torah day and night? This is the obligation of learning Torah just by virtue of the Torah itself. Since Torah as it is on its own, the Torah is beyond measure, the way it is in its source, the way Torah as it really is in its source. Therefore, also the mitzvah of learning Torah, as it emanates from the Torah itself, the instruction, the obligation to learn Torah, as it derives from Torah itself, is that one needs to learn Torah day and night, which means that every free moment, which is in a sense beyond measure. So we have these three dimensions in Torah itself. We have the Tachtein, which is the way of learning Torah as it relates to action, the knowledge of Torah that we need to have in order to know how to behave, how to act in our daily lives. You have the Elyon, the upper dimension of learning Torah, which is knowing the entire Torah. But that has a limit. It is possible to cover the entire Torah. That's the Elyon Sheba Torah, the higher dimension of Torah. Then there is a way of learning Torah which is completely beyond the two, and that is V'hagisa v'yom v'layla, to toil in Torah day and night, which has nothing to do with knowing the Torah for the purpose of knowing how to act. It also has nothing to do with covering the entire Torah, because this instruction is to someone who already knows the entire Torah, and also equally to someone who may never know the entire Torah, which is learning Torah from Torah itself, just for the sake of learning Torah, which is beyond the two.